Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.
Good evening, listener. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's edition, we invite you to leave behind your safe reality and descend with us into the frightening depths of the most terrifying imaginations with 2 audio adaptations of frightening fiction about retold renditions and taunting tones. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and tonight I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. I also wanted to take a moment to thank you for all your donations. Every share, donation, and comment of support helps. Let's keep building this together. Joining us tonight to help bring to life the frightening fiction of Jasper DeWitt and Garcia, our voice talents Justine, Anastasia, and Kevin Barbare. Now, get your ticket ready, take your seat in our theater of the minds, and brace yourself. It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Our first tale this evening is written by Jasper DeWitt and performed by Justine, Anastasia. In this reimagining of the classic tale of Sleepy Hollow, Katrina's desperate letter reveals a chilling curse that haunts her family. On this Halloween night, she rides out to face the Headless Horseman, determined to end the terror one way or another. Now, without further ado, I present to you the legend of Raven Rock.
New York is always most beautiful in the fall, I find, when the leaves form a golden canopy that descends upon you like the wings of dying fairies, and the air shines with smoke and the smell of pumpkin pie. There is nothing half so beautiful, nothing that feels so much like home. A pity that it has been ruined for me. No, not that it has been ruined for me, that it is ruined for me. Every year, without fail, as one more of my sons dies the instant he can sit a horse and thinks himself capable of riding through the hollow, none of them, save one, have ever returned, and that is no comfort. My black dresses and mourning veils, once mere specters in my vast wardrobe, meant to never be worn except at the utmost, have become a second skin. How fitting that the man who holds my poor, dear father's farm was once called Bones. For that today is all I have left, the bones of a future I once dreamed of, but that now, thanks to my own foolishness and to the enduring malevolence of one fiend, has floated away into oblivion, just as the smell of apple pie curdled into frost when winter comes. I have seen barely 15 years of this century and only slightly more of the last, and yet now I know I will see no more. There is only one way to make this curse stop. It began with the schoolmaster. No, I will not give him that title. No creature like that should be given even the purely nominal recognition of having instructed anyone, and it is blasphemous to admit that he ever did. Yet that, indeed, was what he was to our town in the brief and miserable time that I knew him. When that gangly scarecrow of a man sauntered into town, all supercilious manners and wicked tongue, I admit that like so many girls my age, I found him interesting, or at least bizarre. He was certainly a change of pace from the rough manners and rougher advances of my usual suitors, and being so used to those, it was a refreshing change of pace to be treated in the manner of a city lady by one so outwardly sophisticated. The fact that the man who I actually preferred seemed to only know how to treat my affections like one of his horses, and made my heart gallop or heel as he wished, made me all the more relieved to have a suitor whose presence might teach this villain the importance of urgency. And in a way, though my heart did thrill for one above all others, I did not close it entirely to the stranger, whose name so fitted his bird-like aspect and behavior. That he made his overtures to me in the way of singing lessons, at least at first, only deepened the potential for my desires to blossom. For hearing my voice transformed into a match for the prettiest songbird under his instruction made my heart flutter in time with the music. But something always held me back, and that was the look in the stranger's eye, a look of hunger, and not merely the hunger for food, for which he was already famed. No, that was merely the most obvious manifestation of what I came to learn was the terrible, bottomless, all-consuming void that lurked in the place where, in any other man, a soul should have been. I saw that void open its jaws and salivate whenever my singing teacher crossed the threshold of my father's house, and he beheld the prosperity therein. And as for when he looked at me, it was the first time I had the sensation that perhaps I was not a young woman at all, that I was little more than a turkey that he had lusted to carve up for himself. But for the first months of our acquaintance, while this lust was apparent in his gaze, it never showed in his manner. He was scrupulously polite, courtly even, and always ready with a quip or a story, or sometimes even just a particularly rapturous piece of music to beguile me and make me lower my defenses, if only slightly. However, I would always demur, and always he would leave with nothing but ambiguity to sustain him as to my own feelings. And the more that happened, the more the void behind his eyes seemed to grow more terrible than ever, until I was sure that for all his courtly manners and seemingly sincere professions of affection, deep down, it was all the practice of a wolf to get its prey to consent to its own butchering. I should have run from that look. But being young and full of fancies that my coquetry had given me the skills necessary to avoid true danger, I dismissed it as mere frustration, which quenched my fear with the sin of pride. Of course, I knew that my true beloved was also endeavoring to make my strange new suitor's life miserable. News of his pranks and practical jokes upon the hapless rival reached me, thanks to the wagging tongues of gossip, and they only served to embolden me to flirt with the stranger more. Oh, not out of pity or real feeling, you understand, but out of frustration. Why, when simple, earnest love-making to me would have defeated his rival in moments, did the idiot think instead to attack his rival, who would not have existed if not for his having taken my own affection for granted? The idiot! Well, let him endure as much suspense as I could offer then. Perhaps finally, when his pranks and brute aggression failed, he would do what I really wanted and offer me that priceless symbol of commitment that I so desperately prayed he would bring. And so, in spite of my better judgment, I went on encouraging the rival, if only to heighten the jealousy of the true object of my passion. As I said, my new suitor often brought me gifts when he came to the house. So naturally, I thought nothing of it when he came to the house that final time before Halloween and offered me something. Not, this time, flowers or sweetmeats, but a bottle of blood-red wine. I admit to being entranced by this. Dear sweet father was many things, and most of all, he was a good Protestant Dutchman, down to his bones. For him to drink was rare on its own terms, and as for me drinking, he wouldn't hear of it. And so, when my gangly admirer poured me a glass and offered it, I couldn't resist the temptation of doing something so utterly naughty. I drank it down hungrily, like a babe at the breast, and never stopped to notice that while he continued to pour me more glasses, my curious suitor never poured one for himself. The wine, of course, went straight to my head, and rather faster than it should have, even considering my inexperience. In a shockingly short span, I was practically asleep, and only vaguely registered the spider-like hands reaching into my petticoats as the world turned black. However, when I next opened my eyes and saw the monster standing over me, stuffing the foul instrument of his crime back into his trousers, I registered everything. The pain between my legs, the ghastly stickiness on my inner thighs, the awful sickening realization that I had been ruined, against my will, in the most grotesquely intimate manner possible. It was all I could do to keep from screaming when the fiend leered down at me and gloated that soon I would become pregnant, and that my only choice to avoid scandal was now to accept his proposal of marriage, which he would make the day after my father's Halloween frolic. But I was firm. I told him I would rather die than be plundered in this way. His only reply was a horrible, crawling smile before he left, the hunger behind his eyes sleeping for once. I knew then that I could not afford to wait for my beloved to come to his senses. I would have to force them upon him. So that night, I stole out of my father's house in clothes stolen from the servants' quarters, and made my way to the tavern where my true love and his gang held court. Leers and obscene offers and wandering hands besieged me as I made my way through that tavern trying to find him. But my heart was flint, and all this was nothing compared to the indignity I had suffered earlier that day. My persistence was amply rewarded. I found the man I loved and told him straight out that his rival had threatened me, though of course I did not say exactly with what. I begged him to find some way to kill the monster, or failing that, to drive him away. I told him if he could do that, I would be his forever. And I told him the one weakness which I knew the fiend possessed, and which we might be able to exploit, that he was superstitious to the utmost, and would believe even the most outlandish tale if it were told with sufficient conviction. Hearing this, the man I loved swept me up in his arms and kissed me, and promised that he would do all he could. It was almost enough to make me forget the day's violation. Almost, but not quite. Of course, part of the story of what happened has already been told by that fool Diedrich Knickerbocker. That is, at my father's Halloween revel, both the monster and my love attended. That at this party, certain local legends were told. The tale of the woman in white who haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. And the tale of the Hessian mercenary, who was said to haunt the woods in the form of the Headless Horseman. That only at the witching hour did the fiend start for home on the broken-down, pathetic nag he called a horse. That while riding home, he encountered the very Headless Horseman, or someone in his guise, and was chased across the old church bridge, whereupon the horseman threw his head as a parting shot. That the next day, all that was found was the fiend's hat and the remains of a shattered pumpkin, and that shortly thereafter, I and my love did indeed marry, as I had most dearly prayed. On this much, the Knickerbocker account is reliable. On this much and nothing else. Where he is unreliable is in his entertaining the fancy that the monster was somehow still alive, elsewhere in New York, married to a tavern owner of means. This much I know to be untrue. I know exactly where the monster is, or more accurately, where his body is. You see, while I trusted the man I loved to play his part, I had no intention of leaving him to it alone. Bless him. but he was too kind to have the stomach needed for anything grisly. He thought a simple, practical joke in the guise of a ghost would be sufficient to drive the devil away without complaint. But I knew that for all his superstition, our quarry was made of sterner and crueler stuff than that. So while my family slept off the effects of that night's Halloween revels, I once more crept out of the house and down to the church bridge, where I observed the flight of my violator firsthand. And when the headless horseman threw his absurd pumpkin head at the monster, knocking him from his horse and rendering him unconscious, I made my move. And oh, what a clever move it was. My darling thought he had been clever to dress as a ghost, but he was far from the only one. I had clad myself in white, so that any late-night stranger who saw my work would think he had witnessed the appearance of the ghostly woman in white, and rush away in terror rather than get close enough to observe my true identity. Ever so slowly and deliberately, I crept up to the fiend's unconscious form. Ever so slowly and deliberately, I pulled the knife I had secreted under my dress from its hiding place. Ever so slowly and wonderfully, I severed first his head and then his filthy sex from his body. I know it was not a pleasant sight. Even my own lover was terrified and sickened to watch me at my work, and must have been profoundly grateful for the partial blindness offered by his ghostly disguise. When I had finished my work, my dress was no longer white, but stained deep, brackish red with the blood of my tormentor, and I laughed, or screamed, for the sound was much the same, to see a stain so like the wine that had almost been my undoing now signify my triumph over the poisoner who had administered it. As soon as the monster's body had ceased bleeding, my lover, and now my future husband, took both me and it on the back of his horse, and together we hid the filthy thing at the top of Raven Rock, where only an unmarked shallow grave contained it. We knew, all too well, that the scene had been so impeccably staged that everyone would credit the headless horseman with the deed, and would therefore never stop to check the area associated with another ghost. For years after that, I believed the worst was behind me. For years after that, my lover, my dear sweet Brahm, was the dearest husband and father that a wife and mother could dream of. And because he was so dear, I never had the heart to tell him that when our first son was born, with a horribly familiar long nose and gangly limbs, who his true progenitor was. Besides, we had many more children afterwards, and our first son, despite his horrific origins, has grown into a young man worthy of Brahm's name, even if he is cursed with the blood of another. However, it was also thanks to our first son that we learned of the cruel revenge that would soon turn my every waking hour into an act of mourning. For one day, while riding home from the village with his little brother with him, our eldest was set upon by, what else? A headless horseman, but not the Hessian of legend. No, this one had the build of a scarecrow and rode a spectral, broken-down nag that still somehow managed to be faster even than the prize horses that Brahm and I had raised. That headless fiend rode down our two sons, and with the single strike of its fiery blade, cut the head from our poor youngest son's shoulders. But, oh horror, it did not return for our eldest. Rather, the terrible apparition simply inclined the gaping wound where its head should be at him and rode away, because I am convinced it knew, the monster knew his own son. And because it was only me and Brahm he sought revenge on, he is the only son of mine who remains safe, even though every other child of mine that dares to venture out after dark has ended up a decapitated corpse. The thing has never once tried to come for my eldest, because in him, its horrible violation lives on, as does its revenge, because he will one day inherit the wealth and power that I sought to deny to his vile father. I have tried everything to stop it. I have locked what few children I can still bear in the house. I have forbade Brahm to teach them to ride. I have cloistered them away, where the fiend cannot find them and murder them as he has their lost siblings. But I also know that this solution will not last. One day, they will be men and women in their own right, and their mother's keys will no longer bar their way to the outside world, where evil waits to slaughter them. And so I have decided to do the only thing I can, to try the last thing I can think of to save my children, even if it damns me forever. For I remember that while the hunger of that demon in the form of a man was strong when he beheld the riches of my father, it was even stronger and fiercer when it beheld me. It's me he wants. Me who will be the final trophy in his game of revenge. Me alone, perhaps, whose death will appease the fiend's spirit. Or if not, me whose spirit will drag his to the hell where it belongs, rather than let him kill another of my children. And so tonight, on Halloween, at the witching hour, I will ride out to Raven Rock. I will take the most broken down nag we possess. I will wear the whitest dress I own, the dress of a bride, just as the monster wanted. I will go, and for the sake of my children, I will keep my final appointment with the Headless Horseman, with Ichabod Crane, the demon who stole my virtue, and now will steal my life. Forgive me, Brahm. Forgive me, my sweet babies. And forgive me, Sleepy Hollow. Yours with love, Katrina.
I hope you enjoyed The Legend of Raven Rock, as written by Jasper DeWitt and performed by Justine Anastasia. Our second tale of the evening is written by D. Garcia and is performed by Kevin Barbare. In it, a boy's world of hunger and loneliness fades as strange birds bring gifts and an eerie transformation takes place, revealing the dark truth behind a relentless thumping sound. Now, without further ado, I present to you Thump, Thump.
The loud sounds that hurt his ears from Mom and Dad had stopped. It was after the sound stopped that a new sound he had never heard started. Thump, thump, thump. He moved his arms and legs to the rhythm of the sound, and that night he fell asleep as the sound got faster. He bumped his arm on the wall to match the rhythm of the thumping, and fell asleep on the thin blanket he had on the floor near the door. Thump, 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 thump. When it is dark outside the window, the wind blowing makes the sound faster as it shakes the broken screen of his open window. The next morning, the thumping wasn't as loud as it had been at night. It was slow, and at times he thought he could not hear it over the rumbling noises his tummy was making. On the third day after the sound started, he didn't want to move to the beat of the thumping anymore. He preferred instead to sit on the floor by the window. His tummy didn't hurt as much if he didn't move. He would just move his head to the rhythm of the sound. From where he sat on the floor, he could see the dark birds that flew around outside. One big dark bird came and stuck its beak in the hole in the screen and dropped a worm in his once chubby hand. It was warm and soft and felt very wet as he tried to chew it with the few teeth he had in his mouth. The bird made a loud noise at him and then started to busy himself with the hole in the screen. When the thump became louder and the outside was dark, the bird looked at him and then flew off into the night. His juice cup was dry, but he put it to his mouth as a binky and fell asleep to the sound of thunder and rain. He cried loudly as the thump grew louder. Raindrops fell on his face, mixing with his tears, and the world went dark. He used his tongue to lap up the rainwater that had collected on the soggy windowsill. That morning, the dark bird had brought a friend and a mouthful of mushy stuff. It reminded him of the food he had eaten when Daddy took him to meet his friend at the red and yellow place with the clown. He loved the food, but didn't like the way the man touched his leg and took pictures of him when Daddy was changing his diaper. The birds both cawed loudly and began once again to pull at the opening in the screen. They worked together to make it bigger as other birds surrounded the window and sat on the bare branches of the tree in the backyard. When the hole was much bigger, the one bird put his head in slowly and with caution. He ran his little finger over the bird's dark black head. He had never touched a bird before, and he was a little scared. Gentle, gentle. He could remember his grandma saying that to him when he visited her kittens. They were soft and small, and he wanted to hold them close to his face and give them all the kisses he missed from his mommy. But his grandma reminded him that they were babies and that he would hurt them if he did that. He would never hurt them. He wanted to love them, just like he wanted to be loved. He had pouted and instead chose to sit on the ground and watch the kittens play and sleep. Occasionally, he would reach his hand out to them, letting them grab it with their tiny paws. It had tickled, and he remembers it was one of the few times he had laughed so much tears had come from his eyes. So, he stroked the head of one bird softly and then the other, thanking them for the food and for staying with him. It was getting darker, but not outside, just in his eyes, and he wanted to sleep. His tummy didn't hurt when he was asleep. As he lay down, he heard the birds call out frantically again, heard their claws tear at the wire of the screen faster and with more desperation as the night came again. By then, a sleep had overcome him again. Thump, 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 thump. He didn't move much the next day. The birds dropped some more food on the windowsill as they tore at the screen, but the boy couldn't see them. It was only when they opened the screen wide enough did one smaller bird come in and put some grubs in his mouth. The birds outside cawed louder, and the one with wide eyes in the tree hooted. There was a heavy fog that surrounded his eyes, and as hard as he tried, the boy couldn't really open his eyes, let alone his mouth, as he struggled to accept the grubs from his bird friends. Finally, with one booming caw, the screen tore off the window, and into the room flew a torrent of darkness. Wings and feathers fluttered and eddied, covering the dank and dirty room in a vortex of black. Thump, 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 thump. The birds swirled around him faster. The desperation in their song grew louder and frenzied as they dipped and pulled at him, their beaks tearing at the mold and rot that covered the flesh of his tiny body. The cacophony of their cries began to change into one melodious song, lifting his body from the room's dirty, sticky floor. He thought he felt his lips curl into a smile, but that wasn't possible. As he lifted higher, he became absorbed in the torrent of the birds. He felt the pounding of their hearts, their connected consciousness, and the force of their power as he became one with his friends. Looking down, he saw he had changed. His body was strong, and inky black feathers covered his entire form. He opened his beak, and from deep within him came a thunderous sound that shattered the windows of the bleak and desolate house, quieting the thumping sound with a muted and final thud. They stopped and watched him, their dark eyes all-knowing, all-seeing. They each flew out the window and circled the house, waiting for him. He flew out and back into the place that was once so familiar. The smell of rot and garbage overcame his new senses as he circled the room before coming upon what the thumping had been. The ropes had snapped, dropping the bodies to the floor. From outside, his new family called out for him.
I hope you enjoyed Thump, Thump, as written by Garcia and performed by Kevin Barbare. On to the shows. Otis Gyrie and Kevin Barbare have their very own show here on our network, Scary Stories Told in the Dark, which you can hear every Sunday night. We also have Eric Peabody's Horror Hill, a podcast dedicated to some of our deeper and darker tales. We hope you check him out. And Drew Blood's Dark Tales airs Fridays, featuring some southern down-home horror. And don't forget to check out the Fear from the Heartland archives, featuring more than 120 episodes. Also, don't forget, we have our own book out. Since 2012, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights has been keeping people awake through the night with terrifying audio renditions of tales from the darkest minds modern memory has to offer. Now, in this first of 3 volumes, collected are 30 tales never before available by some of the most prolific and talented authors of the online community, each one accompanied by a suitably grim illustration by David Romero. Strange cats, body mutilations, demonic apartments, revenge from beyond the grave, and yes, even a man-eating monster or two. All of these and more beckon you further into the darkness. Turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Huh? Who needs sleep anyway? Check it out today by visiting www.chillingbook.com. Well, friends, our weekly descent into the depths has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for tonight and remind you, take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram if you haven't already. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find an archive of our work going back to 2012. And consider signing up as a patron at our website, chillingtalesfordarknights.com, to show your support and get all of our content ad-free. I'm your host of the evening, Steve Taylor, and it's been a pleasure. Tune in again next week when we once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.